April 1945. The final desperate days of the European theater unfolded across a landscape scarred by 5 years of relentless warfare. The German Reich, once the pinnacle of military might, now crumbled beneath the combined assault of Soviet forces sweeping in from the east and Allied armies advancing from the west. In the Austrian Alps, deep within a fortress that had been transformed into a prisoner of war camp, 113 German soldiers awaited a fate that seemed sealed by the very machinery of history they had helped to set in motion. These were not the idealistic young men who had marched into Poland in 1939, nor were they the hardened veterans of the Russian front who had tasted the bitter cold of endless winters. Instead, they were survivors, men hollowed out by years of sacrifice, starvation, and the slow realization that the war they had been told was righteous had become something else entirely. The camp itself stood as a monument to the exhaustion of war. The wooden barracks sagged under the weight of time and despair. The fence that encircled the compound was rusted in places, maintained by a garrison of guards who themselves looked barely more nourished than the men they held captive. Food rations were meager by any standard. A thin soup distributed once daily, hard black bread that crumbled between teeth, and on rare occasions, a small portion of cheese or preserved meat. The men had learned to stretch these meager provisions, to find sustenance in the sparse vegetation that grew around the perimeter, to trade and barter with each other for the smallest scraps that might ease the constant gnawing hunger that never truly ceased. Among the guards assigned to Camp Redlzipf, as it was known, stood Sergeant James Henderson, a 26-year-old soldier from Iowa who had arrived at the compound just 3 months earlier. Unlike many of his fellow guards, Henderson possessed a quality that seemed anachronistic in the machinery of war and captivity: an ability to see the men before him not as enemies, but as human beings whose suffering transcended nationality. His fellow soldiers spoke of him with a mixture of affection and bewilderment. The soft heart, some called him, though never with true cruelty in their voices. Henderson had grown up on a farm in the heartland of America, the son of a Baptist minister and a schoolteacher. His upbringing had instilled in him a sense of moral clarity that survived even the chaos and brutality of warfare. Where other guards maintained strict distance, adhering to the protocols of captivity with rigid formality, Henderson found himself drawn to small acts of mercy that seemed insignificant in the grand scheme of the war's conclusion, yet meant everything to the men who received them. The first connection between Henderson and the German prisoners was established almost by accident. It began with a young soldier named Klaus Dietrich, a 19-year-old from Munich whose eyes bore the haunted expression common to all those who had survived the Eastern Front. Klaus had fallen ill with dysentery, a scourge that swept through the camp with predictable regularity given the sanitation conditions and malnutrition that weakened every man's defenses. The camp's meager infirmary was overseen by a harried medic with almost no supplies and little ability to do more than provide aspirin and encouragement. Klaus lay in the corner of the barracks, burning with fever, his body racked with spasms, when Henderson discovered him during a routine patrol. The young sergeant knelt beside Klaus, noting the pallor of his skin, the uncontrollable shaking. Without speaking, Henderson made a decision that would have consequences he could not yet foresee. That night, Henderson brought Klaus a portion of his own evening ration, supplemented with water he had boiled and cooled. Over the following weeks, Henderson continued this quiet intervention, providing Klaus with extra nourishment, checking on him daily, even using his limited access to the camp's medical supplies to acquire sulfa powder that he believed might help fight the infection. The other prisoners noticed. They watched as Klaus slowly began to recover, as the fever subsided, as the young man's body began to regain some semblance of strength. Within a month, Klaus was walking again, weak but alive, when others afflicted with the same malady had perished. The German soldiers began to speak of Henderson in hushed tones, not with suspicion, but with a kind of reverence typically reserved for saints. But Henderson's mercy did not end with Klaus. Once the barrier had been broken, once the initial act of compassion had been committed, others came forward with their own desperate needs. Joachim, a former artillery captain whose teeth had begun to rot from malnutrition and poor hygiene, received a small bundle of cloth to use as a makeshift toothbrush, along with some salt that Henderson had managed to acquire. Werner, a signals officer whose feet had developed severe frostbite during the previous winter, was provided with extra blankets and petroleum jelly to prevent further deterioration. Franz, who had lost most of his hearing in a shell blast and struggled to understand orders that could mean the difference between punishment and reprieve, found in Henderson a man who took the time to communicate clearly, to ensure the young man was never caught unaware. Word of Henderson's actions spread through the camp like whispered prayer. The prisoners began to understand that within the hierarchy of guards and captors, there existed one man who did not view their suffering as the natural consequence of their nation's defeat. More significantly, Henderson's actions were not rooted in any belief that the German soldiers deserved mercy, but rather in a conviction that all human beings, regardless of uniform or origin, deserved to be treated with a basic dignity that transcended the abstractions of war. By late April, as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, the situation at Camp Rettelzipf had become increasingly chaotic. News reached the camp that the Russians were advancing with extraordinary speed through Austria. The prisoner guards, many of whom were themselves conscripted men with little loyalty to the Nazi regime that now lay in ruins, began to consider their own survival. The camp commander, a Colonel Reinhardt who had been more administrator than fanatic, received orders from higher command that seemed designed to ensure that no German prisoners survived to be interrogated by either Soviet or American forces. The order was to liquidate the camp, to march the prisoners into the surrounding mountains and leave them there to die of exposure and starvation, erasing evidence of their captivity. Colonel Reinhardt was faced with a choice that would define not only the final days of his own life, but the lives of 113 men under his command. The colonel was not an evil man, though the war had forced him to commit acts that he would never reconcile. He understood that the order he had received, while framed in military language, was essentially a death sentence. That night, he made the decision to disobey. He would not march the prisoners to their deaths. Instead, he would wait, hoping that the American forces advancing into Austria would reach the camp before the Russians. Henderson was aware of the order and its implications. He understood that the situation had become extraordinarily dangerous, that the moment of vulnerability between the withdrawal of German military authority and the arrival of foreign forces could spell catastrophe for the men imprisoned in the camp. That night, unable to sleep, Henderson made a choice that would alter the trajectory of the remainder of his life. He went to Colonel Reinhardt's quarters and requested an audience. In the commander's office, a Spartan room lit by a single lamp, Henderson spoke with the clarity of conviction. He told Reinhardt that he could not, in good conscience, allow an order for execution to stand. He explained that he had come to know these men, not as soldiers of a defeated enemy, but as human beings trapped by circumstances beyond their control. He argued that the war was effectively over, that the moral authority of any military command had been superseded by the urgency of simple human survival. He promised that if Reinhardt would join him in protecting the prisoners, Henderson would ensure that the colonel himself would be treated fairly by whatever Allied force arrived first. It was an extraordinary conversation, conducted between two men who found themselves suddenly united by the threat of imminent barbarism. Reinhardt listened carefully. The colonel had fought in 2 wars, had seen the worst of what military discipline could produce when divorced from moral principle. He made his decision. He would stand with Henderson. Together, they informed the skeleton guard force that remained at the camp that the prisoners would not be marched to their deaths. Instead, the prisoners would be protected. Any soldier who attempted to harm them would answer to both Reinhardt and Henderson. The bluff worked. Perhaps the guards themselves had no appetite for mass murder. Perhaps they, too, had been worn down by years of warfare. Regardless, the order was not carried out. The following days were filled with an uncertain waiting. Intelligence reports suggested that Soviet forces were perhaps 40 kilometers away, advancing rapidly. American forces were known to be somewhere to the west, but their exact position remained unclear. The prisoners sensed the change in atmosphere. Guards who had maintained distance now sometimes spoke directly to the men. Food rations, while still meager, seemed slightly more generous, as if there was a collective understanding that everyone at the camp was now engaged in a struggle for survival against elements beyond their control. Henderson took the additional step of organizing the prisoners into work details that would improve the camp's conditions, not out of military necessity, but as a way of maintaining order and giving the men a sense of purpose and agency. He worked alongside them, moving supplies, repairing the fence where necessary, ensuring that the latrines were properly maintained. For the first time in months, the prisoners felt as though they were participants in their own survival rather than merely subjects of authority. On the 27th of April, American forces approached the camp. Scout vehicles appeared on the road leading to the compound, and a new order was established. The American commander, a major whose name escapes the historical record, but whose pragmatism proved invaluable, quickly assessed the situation. He understood that Reinhardt had protected the prisoners, and he ordered that the camp be secured without unnecessary violence or recrimination. The transition was remarkably smooth given the chaos that typically accompanied the liberation of prisoner of war camps. The prisoners were informed that they were now under American control and would eventually be processed for repatriation or transfer to other facilities. But something had shifted in the prisoners' consciousness. They had witnessed one man, operating within the machinery of military hierarchy, choose to act according to conscience rather than orders. They had seen that resistance to unjust command was possible, that humanity could prevail even in the darkest institutional settings. More immediately, they had learned that they owed their lives to Sergeant James Henderson, a man who had made a choice that could easily have resulted in his own court-martial and execution. In the days following the American takeover of the camp, the prisoners organized themselves to express their gratitude. It was not a formal ceremony, but rather a gathering that occurred during the evening meal when the American guards were occupied with their own duties. 113 men, representing every region of Germany, every social class and educational background, every religious affiliation and political persuasion, stood together in the center of the camp's open ground. Klaus Dietrich, the young man whose recovery had sparked Henderson's mission of mercy, stepped forward and addressed the sergeant in German first, then in broken English. Klaus spoke of the moment when Henderson had knelt beside his fevered body, offering food and water when he could easily have ignored him. He spoke of watching others recover because of Henderson's interventions, seeing men who should have died live on because one American soldier had chosen to see them as men rather than as enemy uniforms. Klaus wept as he spoke, and his tears were echoed in the eyes of many of the prisoners who stood around him. He concluded by saying, in English that he had carefully rehearsed, "We can't live without you. You saved us not from the war, but from the machinery of war itself." The words rippled through the assembled men. One by one, other prisoners stepped forward to add their voices to Klaus's testimony. Joachim spoke of how the gift of simple dignity, demonstrated through Henderson's consistent respect, had made the difference between despair and hope. Werner described how the care given to his frostbitten feet had been more than medical attention. It was an affirmation that his suffering mattered, that he was worthy of consideration in a world that had spent years treating him as expendable. Franz, who struggled to communicate due to his hearing loss, was helped to speak by other prisoners who repeated his words. He told Henderson that the respect shown to him, the patience and clear communication, had restored his sense of place in a community of human beings. As the testimony continued, Henderson stood with tears streaming down his face. He had not acted with expectation of recognition or gratitude. His interventions had been motivated by something more basic, a simple refusal to allow the abstract categorizations of war to override his perception of concrete human suffering. Yet here, before him, stood the living evidence of what had seemed like small gestures transmuted into something sacred, something that had literally meant the difference between life and death for over 100 human beings. The prisoners presented Henderson with a gift that had been constructed from materials they had gathered and traded for within the camp. It was a small wooden cross, carved from scrap wood and polished smooth. Into its surface, they had etched the names of every man in the camp, a memorial to the fact that not one of them had perished under his watch. The craftsmanship was extraordinary given the tools available, and the symbolism was unmistakable. They had carved a representation of resurrection, the salvation narrative that stood at the heart of Christian theology, into a physical object that they presented to the man who had given them back their lives. Henderson accepted the cross and held it to his chest. He attempted to speak but found that emotion had rendered him temporarily unable to articulate his thoughts. When he finally did speak, his words were simple. He told the prisoners that their survival was not his gift to them, but their right as human beings. He said that he had done what any person of conscience should have done, what he hoped would have been done for him had circumstances been reversed. He told them that their gratitude, while deeply moving, should be directed not toward him alone, but toward the recognition that in the darkest moments of human civilization, when systems and structures conspire toward destruction, there remains always the possibility of individual choice, of people choosing to act according to conscience rather than convenience or expedience. Over the following weeks, as the American military processed the prisoners and prepared them for eventual return to Germany, Henderson maintained his connection with the men he had protected. He ensured that they received adequate nutrition as they regained their strength, that they were treated fairly by the American forces now responsible for them, and that their voices were heard when it came time to document the camp's liberation. The story of Henderson and the prisoners at Camp Rettelzipf might easily have been lost to history, subsumed into the vast narrative of the war's conclusion and the millions of individual stories of survival that characterized 1945. But the prisoners made certain that it would not be forgotten. As they were eventually repatriated to Germany in the months following the war's end, they carried with them the wooden cross, and they carried with them the testimony to what one man's moral courage had accomplished. In Germany, in the years after the war's conclusion, as the nation grappled with the question of how to rebuild itself morally and physically after the catastrophe of Nazism, the story of Henderson's intervention at Camp Rettelzipf became something of a quiet legend. It was told in churches and in schools not as propaganda, but as an example of how individual conscience could manifest in institutional settings, how one person's choice to treat others as human beings could reverberate through time and circumstance in ways that transcended national boundaries or historical enmities. Klaus Dietrich eventually became a teacher in Munich, and he made it a point to speak with his students about the American soldier who had saved his life. He emphasized that the war had been a moral catastrophe that had ensnared entire populations in its machinery, but that within that machinery, there had been moments of grace, instances where people chose to act according to their deepest convictions rather than according to the orders and ideologies that attempted to constrain them. Klaus would hold up the wooden cross, now fragile with age, and tell his students that this object represented something more profound than mere gratitude. It represented the assertion of human dignity in the face of systems designed to annihilate it. Joachim, the artillery captain, became a businessman in the Rhineland and maintained correspondence with Henderson throughout his life. In letters carefully preserved in archives, Joachim wrote of the profound impact that Henderson's actions had had on his understanding of what it meant to be human. He explained that growing up in Nazi Germany had meant learning to think in terms of categories and hierarchies, in terms of us and them, of superior and inferior races. Henderson's refusal to accept these categories, his insistence on treating German prisoners as men deserving of respect and dignity, had shattered something in Joachim's worldview. It had opened a space for him to imagine a different way of being in the world, one based on recognition of shared humanity rather than on the rigid categorizations that had brought so much suffering. Werner, who had feared that his frostbitten feet would leave him permanently disabled, eventually recovered sufficiently to pursue a career as a musician. He attributed his recovery not only to the physical care he had received from Henderson, but to the psychological restoration that had come from being treated as a person worthy of consideration. Music became his way of expressing gratitude, of translating into sound the feeling of being brought back from the edge of annihilation. The American command recognized the significance of Henderson's actions, though not immediately. It took several years for the full story to emerge through testimony provided by the prisoners and by Colonel Reinhardt, who survived the war and lived for several decades afterward. Henderson was eventually decorated for his actions, receiving recognition not only for protecting the prisoners but for maintaining order and preventing the kind of humanitarian catastrophe that could easily have occurred during those final, chaotic days of the war in Europe. Yet Henderson himself remained modest about his accomplishments. In interviews conducted after the war, he repeatedly returned to the same theme. He had not considered his actions to be extraordinary or worthy of special commendation. He had simply done what he believed to be right when confronted with a situation that demanded moral choice. He argued that the real tragedy was not that he had acted with mercy, but that such mercy had seemed extraordinary, that the default expectation had been cruelty or indifference. He believed that, in a world ordered according to principles of genuine human dignity, his actions would have been entirely unremarkable, simply the baseline of how people treated one another. Henderson returned to Iowa after the war and eventually became a pastor himself, following in the footsteps of his father. From his pulpit, he spoke often about the obligation that individuals bear to resist unjust authority, to maintain moral clarity in the face of systemic pressure to do otherwise. He emphasized that conscience was not a luxury for peacetime, but a necessity in all circumstances, that the moments when it was most difficult to listen to one's conscience were precisely those moments when conscience mattered most. The prisoners, too, carried forward the lessons they had learned. They became teachers, musicians, businessmen, and community leaders who carried with them the understanding that human dignity could be asserted even in the darkest circumstances, that individual choice could make the difference between catastrophe and survival. They became advocates for reconciliation between Germany and the Allied nations, understanding that the cycle of warfare and revenge could only be broken if people could learn to see one another across national and historical boundaries. By the 1960s, several decades after the war's conclusion, the prisoners organized a reunion. They invited Henderson to Germany, and he accepted. Klaus Dietrich, now an established educator, welcomed Henderson to Munich. The American sergeant, now middle-aged and bearing the weight of decades, walked through the streets of the city where Klaus had grown up, where the young man had nearly died of dysentery in a prisoner of war camp, where an American soldier had reached down and pulled him back from the brink. The reunion took place in a church, chosen deliberately for its spiritual significance. 113 men, or as many as had survived and could gather, stood with the man who had saved their lives. Some had aged gracefully, others bore the permanent marks of their wartime suffering, but all of them carried the same conviction. They understood that they existed in the aftermath of their captivity because one man had chosen, at a critical moment, to recognize their humanity in defiance of systems and orders that attempted to deny it. The prisoners presented Henderson with a gift that had been created specifically for this occasion. It was a large wooden panel on which had been carved and inlaid, with extraordinary artistic skill, the image of the original cross they had carved for him decades earlier. But surrounding it were 113 figures, each one representing a man whose life had been saved. The inscription, written in both German and English, read simply, "We can't live without you," in gratitude for a man who chose conscience over command. Henderson wept openly as he received this gift. In his speech to the assembled prisoners, he spoke of the profound privilege it had been to witness the resilience of the human spirit, to see men broken by war and captivity nonetheless maintain their capacity for gratitude and for the recognition of grace. He told them that their survival had not been his achievement, but their own triumph over circumstances designed to destroy them. He emphasized that they had not survived because they were special or chosen, but because they had maintained their dignity as human beings, and because in a moment when the world seemed determined to erase them, they had found one person who refused to accept the logic of erasure. The connection between Henderson and the prisoners endured until their deaths. Klaus Dietrich died in 1989, having lived to see the fall of the Berlin Wall, the reunification of Germany, and the beginning of a new chapter in European history. In his will, he designated that the large wooden panel created for the reunion be donated to a museum dedicated to the history of the Second World War, so that future generations might understand the story of how one man's moral courage had made possible the survival of over 100 human beings. Henderson lived into the early years of the 21st century, and until his final days, he maintained that what he had done had been nothing remarkable, merely what any person of conscience should have done. He refused to characterize himself as a hero, preferring to see himself as simply a person who had made a choice. Yet his life became a testament to the possibility of moral action within oppressive systems, to the reality that individual conscience could assert itself against institutional pressure, and that such assertion could have consequences that rippled forward through decades and generations. The story of the 113 German prisoners of war and the American sergeant who saved their lives became a symbol of something that transcends national boundaries and historical enmities. It became a testament to the proposition that humanity itself is the baseline from which all other considerations must flow, that war creates categories of enemy and soldier, captive and captor, but that beneath all of these categories lies a common human dignity that cannot be overwritten by institutional mandate or military command. When people asked Henderson, as they often did in his later years, what had driven him to act as he had, he would return to his childhood, to his parents' teachings about the obligation to recognize and honor the dignity of every human being. He would speak of moments in his own military service when he had witnessed what cruelty and indifference could produce, and how he had resolved that he would never be complicit in such actions when he had the power to resist them. He would emphasize that the choice he had made at Camp Rettelzipf had not been extraordinary, but rather a straightforward application of principles that he believed should guide all human action. The prisoners, in their letters and testimonies, consistently returned to a single theme. They described the moment when Henderson's kindness had interrupted their expectation of suffering and death. They spoke of the psychological transformation that had occurred when they realized that an American soldier did not see them as enemies to be despised or as abstractions to be processed according to military regulations, but as fellow human beings deserving of respect and dignity. They described how this recognition had enabled their survival not only physically, but spiritually, allowing them to maintain their sense of themselves as moral agents capable of gratitude, kindness, and love even in the midst of captivity and deprivation. The wooden cross, worn smooth by decades of handling, was eventually photographed and documented. The names carved into it became a record of 113 lives that might have been lost but were preserved because one man chose conscience over command. Each name represented not only survival, but the continuation of a life that produced families and communities, teachers and artists, people who carried forward the understanding that human dignity was not negotiable, not subject to the vicissitudes of war or the mandate of authority. The story of Henderson and the prisoners reminds us that even in the darkest moments of human history, when systems and structures conspire toward destruction, there remains always the possibility of individual choice, of people deciding to act according to their deepest moral convictions. It reminds us that such choices often seem small and insignificant in the moment, yet can reverberate forward through time in ways that alter the trajectory of lives and communities. It reminds us that we can't live without one another, that our survival and our humanity are fundamentally interconnected, and that the recognition of this interdependence is the foundation upon which all genuine morality must be built.